Dumping waste in somebody else's house is horrible, but it's happening all the time. Not only that has happened on pinpointed cases, like, for example, garbage sent over to the Philippines by Canada, or dumping nuclear waste in the ocean. Some European countries have done it. And there is more, of course. But probably the worst of all now, because it affects absolutely all of us, besides animals, plants, and whatever living things are on the world, is that the climate is warming, and most probably so by the accumulation of greenhouse gases. Now, this is a very interesting thing for us, not because we can solve it, but because there are so many players with different interests that the exercise of framing the problem is interesting for us for training purposes. So let's go ahead. By now, I think we can agree that the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere is bad, bad for your health, bad for everybody. Now, the question is what to do about it, because the interests are very diverse, not only between developed countries and developing ones. No, even amongst the latter, the differences are great. And even amongst the advanced ones, there's some that might benefit from greenhouse gases accumulation. Let's see it. For instance, countries that are close to the Arctic zone might benefit somewhat from the fact that the climate is warming. Think, for example, that some countries could extend their planting and harvesting area. Or think, for example, that with the melting of the ice in the Arctic zone, there may be a northwest passage or another passage to Asia that will be shorter than going even through the Suez Canal. You see? So the interests are quite diverse, even amongst developed countries. Now, the great divide is between developed and developing countries. If you look at that map, the pink areas are the ones which are more responsible for the historical accumulation of greenhouse gases. The green ones are the ones that are not responsible as much for the greenhouse gases today in the atmosphere, but, surprise, they may be increasingly more responsible for that. Indeed, it's the share of the purple and red areas that will increase in the future. But we're all in it together, right? I mean, the atmosphere is ours. We should not be dumping greenhouse gases in it. So, because the problem is great and it involves all mankind, then what we have to do is find an objective criteria of what we can do together in order to limit the damage. And for the last few years, the agreement has been that we have to limit the warming of the climate to no more than 2 degrees centigrade. It's bad enough to get the sort of 12 advanced economies to see the problem eye to eye. But when it comes to developing countries, the problem is increasingly difficult because we're not talking of 12 countries, but 10 dozens of them. So before, a couple of years ago, the advanced economies would think, well, we can pay them off and the problem will be washed away. But now we've come to realize that the developing countries are not only very many, but they don't even see the problem under the same light. So it's not a question of paying them out, because we would even have to figure out how much to pay each one of them. It's not only the amount of developing countries that we are concerned with. The size of it, the importance of the numbers is also significant, because the human mind cannot deal appropriately or effectively with perhaps more than 4 options, 4 alternatives, 4 countries, 4 contingencies. Best minds, perhaps 7. God knows, stretch it to 12. Still, we have about 10, 15 times as many developing countries. So we have to figure out one way to bring them together through some sort of clustering that would allow us to picture the problem in a more manageable dimension. It has been tried, but the problem is that these countries have struck alliances over the time, over history, which are mostly based on geographical proximity. So you have Latin American countries, though they are not the same. You've got many African countries, though they are not the same, and so on and so forth. Well, difficult as it is to bring such a large number of countries to see eye to eye, or at least in groups, so that we can decide a policy for each of the groups, we have the problem of the criteria. The criteria seem scientific enough, objective enough. Like, for example, no more than 2 degrees centigrade of warming. But the fact is that, we're not getting much further on this, because the countries that emit a lot of greenhouse gases will suffer if you limit the amount that they contribute to the atmosphere. And they don't really want to do that. So perhaps if we suggested another objective criteria, let's be cheeky about it. I mean, why not seek to ensure the distribution of the same life expectancy across regions? Aha! Well, isn't that what is behind the no more than 2 degrees centigrade warming? Just leave everybody where they are, and the atmosphere will not increase in temperature, but leave them where they are. But no, you could still have an increase in atmosphere and shift the people around. Huh? It's not that attractive to many of the countries, but it's happening already, disorderly in any case. You have all these problems of North Africans setting off to Europe on those rafts, which are not very accommodating, and all these Central Americans bunging against the border on the northern Mexico border with the US. So it's happening in any case. Why? Because people don't like the living standards that they have in their countries. So you see, behind objective criteria, there are interests as well. And this is what it makes it very difficult to turn them into an operational criteria.